In 1982, the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Population held its first conference on August 9th. 12 years later, the UN General Assembly in its resolution marked August 9th as the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. Even though India voted in favour of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples 2007, it did not give separate recognition to Indigenous people in the country. While the debate over Indigenous identities continues, recognition of the 5th and 6th Schedule, constitutionally guaranteed reservation for 705 ethnic groups known as Scheduled Tribes, Forest Conservation Act 1980, Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989. Apart from India, indigenous communities are the most neglected worldwide. South America and the Caribbean is home to 50 million indigenous peoples. They have a 60% higher infant mortality rate as compared to the rest of the population. There is also a high rate of substance abuse, depression, and HIV/AIDS. 2 centuries of colonial rule and migration of slaves have had an adverse impact on their health. Asia is home to 14.2 million indigenous people. They die early, have high rates of malnutrition and child mortality. The languages spoken by indigenous populations are not recognized by the state either. Africa also constitutes 14.2 million indigenous people. Major health issues include high infant mortality, HIV/AIDS, anemia, and tuberculosis. In sub-Saharan Africa, the ratio of traditional healers to the population is 1:500. For doctors trained in Western medicine, the ratio is 1:40,000. The Pacific, with 12 million indigenous people, has high rates of avoidable deaths, malnutrition, alcohol abuse, smoking, mental stress, and depression. Colonialism and Christianity destroyed traditional healthcare practices and introduced new diseases among indigenous people. North America, with 6.6 million people, has high prevalence of diabetes. Suicide rate in indigenous young is 3.5 times higher than the national average, in addition to violence and alcohol abuse. Government policy in the US and Canada to forcefully send indigenous kids to boarding schools to expunge their identities has pushed suicide rates and mental distress higher. The Arctic, with 2.75 million indigenous people, has high rates of chronic diseases, suicide, and tobacco-related diseases. Colonization of Greenland by Denmark, for instance, has affected the health of Sami people, who do not speak Danish, the common language of doctors. Russia, with only 50,000 indigenous people, has high levels of genetic and psychological disorders, stress, myopia, heart diseases, and cancer. Migration has reduced indigenous population from 56% of the total population in 1926 to just 4.4% in 1989. Pollution is extensively degrading the habitat of indigenous people as well. Although they comprise less than 5% of the world population, indigenous people protect 80% of the world's biodiversity in the ecosystems in which they have lived for centuries. And it becomes extremely important to recognize this contribution in a warming world.